Right now, you're going to watch a video performance of a show produced by Randy and Bill Cohen and performed by Bill and me. And we are going to revisit the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So, a little bit about Bill Cohen, my friend. Bill Cohen links history with music and memorabilia at concerts about the turbulent 1960s in general and the civil rights movement in particular. He also performs public concerts with other themes: Thanksgiving, gratitude, growing older, the many facets of romantic love, and oldies but goodies. Randy, Bill's wife, has been an amazing producer of this show for the last 8 years. We started performing Songs of Struggle in 2013 on the anniversary of Dr. King's March on Washington. And so we reenacted this. Randy put together a very professional video, and Liz is going to cue that up for us. So we will have a few moments after the video to take some questions and have some dialogue with Bill and me.
Whenever Americans think of the civil rights movement, the first thought many of us have is of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., the activist, the minister, the humanitarian, the martyr. But we sometimes spend so much time and energy reflecting on him, we forget movements for social change are much more than their leaders. In fact, they're not successful unless they involve thousands of everyday citizens. And so today we're going to recall a very specific time, 1960 to 1965, when some so-called ordinary people took extraordinary action, fighting non-violently for simple, basic human rights. Blacks and whites marched together, they sang together, they were threatened and beaten together, and sometimes they were even murdered together in this cause. And so today, we remember and celebrate the activists and their courage. I'm Bill Cohen.
And I'm Paisha Thomas. When you're up against violent threats, police dogs, and the possibility of jail, you need something to bolster your courage. And the civil rights activists of the early 1960s often were inspired and emboldened by songs. Simple songs with simple words and melodies. Songs they could sing together to remind themselves that their cause was just and they were not alone. For this set, we'll sing some of the songs that the civil rights activists sang as they faced violence, jail, and possible death. And we'll watch some vintage footage film of the triumphs and tragedies of the movement. Looking back a half a century later, this early struggle was about rights we take for granted these days. Simple, basic things like the right for Black people to eat in a restaurant with whites, drink from the same drinking fountains, and stay in the same hotels, swim in the same swimming pools, attend the same schools, and sit together in the front of the bus. But in the early 1960s, state laws in the Deep South actually forbid the races to mix in those ways. That is, until the protests and the songs knocked down those walls.
If you miss me at the back of the bus and you can't find me nowhere, oh, come on over to the front of the bus. I'll be riding right there. I'll be riding right there. Oh, I'll be riding right there. Oh, come on over to the front of the bus. And I'll be riding right there. If you miss me on the picket line and you can't find me nowhere, oh, come on over to the city jail. I'll be rooming right there. I'll be rooming right there. Oh, I'll be rooming right there. Oh, come on over to the city jail. I'll be rooming right there. If you miss me in the Mississippi River and you can't find me nowhere, oh, come on over to the city pool. I'll be swimming right there. I'll be swimming right there. Oh, I'll be swimming right there. Oh, come on over to the city pool. I'll be swimming right there. If you miss me in the cotton fields, you can't find me nowhere, oh, come on over to the courthouse. I'll be voting right there. I'll be voting right there, oh, I'll be voting right there, oh, come on over to the courthouse. I'll be voting right there.
In February 1960, 4 black college students sat down at a Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, waiting to be served. For weeks they would not be, because of store policy not to serve blacks. But they returned day after day. Within weeks, dozens of similar sit-ins were staged across the Deep South. Despite being taunted, roughed up, threatened with jail, the young activists persevered, and eventually all the lunch counters were integrated.
The date was February 1st, 1960. The 4 teenagers, freshmen at a local university, entered Woolworth's and began shopping for school supplies. It was a calculated move, meant to point out the hypocrisy of a store which would accept their money at the checkout, but not at the lunch counter. Receipts in hand, 2 by 2, they approached the forbidden stools.
All around this room, the bottom lips of the patrons were dropping, and people were just absolutely standing and staring and looking as though they were fixed in time.
McCain expected to be cracked over the head, hauled off to jail, or both. And sure enough, a police officer soon appeared.
And he started to pace the counter back and forth, and as he walked back and forth, he started to pound his nightstick in his hand. But after he paced 3 times with his nightstick, I said to myself, we've got him. He really doesn't know what to do.
The Greensboro Four, they would soon be called: David Richmond, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair, and Joseph McNeil. The defiance and pride visible on their faces would be severely tested in the months ahead. Every day, the Greensboro Four and a growing number of black and white supporters returned to the lunch counter. Taking shifts, they occupied the counter stools all day, enduring insults and threats from hostile bystanders. With newspapers, television, and radio closely following the protest, sit-ins spread throughout the South. Segregated lunch counters in 54 cities were taken over by the protesters. Still, the management of the Greensboro Woolworths stuck by its guns, and the corporate bosses kept out of it. For 6 months, protesters and waitresses glared at each other across this counter. Finally, on July 25th, 1960, the F.W. Woolworth Company ordered the Greensboro store to give in. Throughout the department store chain, the lunch counters were officially desegregated.
As time went on, it ceased to matter because you could come in around lunchtime and you could see alternating almost black, white, black, white, black, white patrons, and nobody paid much attention to it. And you ask yourself, I did quite often, what was all the fuss about? What was all the mistreatment about? I mean, what was this thing that people were so afraid of?
We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. We're fighting for our freedom. We shall not be moved. Fighting for our freedom. We shall not be moved, just like a tree standing by the water. Fighting for our children, we shall not be moved. Fighting for our children, we shall not be moved. Just like a tree standing by the water, we shall not be moved. Black and white together, we shall not be moved. Black and white together, we shall not be moved. Just like a tree standing by the water, we shall not be moved.
By 1961, the federal courts had already ruled that state laws segregating blacks and whites on interstate buses and bus stations were unconstitutional. But those rulings were not enforced in the Deep South. And so black and white civil rights activists decided on a unique campaign to prod the federal government to enforce those court rulings. It was the Freedom Rides. Two integrated groups of freedom riders began in Washington, D.C. They boarded buses and they headed south. Their goal to ride through Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, all the way to New Orleans. When the Freedom Riders on a Greyhound bus neared Anniston, Alabama, all hell broke loose. White racists flattened the tires of the bus, forcing it to stop near a small grocery store. Here's a brief excerpt of the story, as told through the eyes of some of the Freedom Riders themselves, and a white witness who was only 12 years old at the time. She sympathized with the Freedom Riders, even though her father owned that grocery store and told her that he and some of his buddies had planned a violent welcome for the Freedom Riders.
Didn't look good for us.
I'm like everyone else on the bus. I'm pretty afraid, okay? That's putting it mildly.
I watched as a man raised his arm above the crowd with a crowbar, and he broke out one of the back windows of the bus.
You could hear him say, throw it in, and asking, where is the gas, where is the gas?
The hand went down, and when it came back up, it had some object in it that he threw into that hole.
And there was immediate flash fire on the bus.
Pretty soon, the whole back of the bus was black. You couldn't even see in front of your face.
So I ran up to the front of the bus, and I tried to open the door. Only thing I could hear is, let's burn them niggers. Let's burn them niggers alive. At that moment, the fuel tank exploded. I heard somebody say, it's going to go, it's going to go. And they ran, and that was the only way we could get that door open.
The door burst open and people just spilled out into the yard. They were practically tripping over each other because they were so sick and they needed to get some air.
I can't tell you if I walked off the bus or if I crawled off or someone pulled me off.
When I got off the bus, a man came up to me, and I'm coughing and strangling. He said, boy, you all right? And I nodded my head, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground. He had hit me with part of a baseball bat.
People were gagging and they were crawling around on the ground. They were trying to get the smoke out of their chest. It was just an awful, 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 awful scene.
It was horrible. It was like a scene from hell. It was the worst suffering I'd ever heard. And I heard, water, please give me water. Oh God, I need water. I walked right out into the middle of that crowd. I picked me out one person. I washed her face, I held her, gave her water to drink. And as soon as I thought she was going to be okay, I got up and picked out somebody else.
As I'm getting up off the ground, 4 or 5 guys coming at me again. And this is when I see the highway patrolman. He pulls his gun and he fired in the air. He says, "Okay, you've had your fun. Let's move back." And that's what stopped it.
That action did indeed stop the violence against the riders, the Freedom Riders on the Greyhound bus. But the riders on a second bus, a Trailways bus, later faced their own hell. They were attacked by white mobs in Montgomery and were beaten bloody. The 21 Freedom Riders were outnumbered by more than 300 in the mob. But despite the violence against them, the Freedom Riders did not physically fight back. They fought back only by simply declaring that their nonviolent, passive resistance protest would continue. Some of the Freedom Riders were arrested and sent to the notorious Parchment Penitentiary. But that only sparked more sympathy and support for the Freedom Riders from across the nation. And soon more Freedom Riders flocked to the Deep South in more buses.
TV coverage of the violence against the Freedom Riders sparked so much empathy for the demonstrators that the federal government finally ordered true enforcement of the court rulings that had declared an end to discrimination in interstate bus travel. No more separate waiting rooms at bus terminals. No more separate seating on the buses. I'm on my way to the freedom land. I'm on my way to the freedom land. I'm on my way to the freedom land. I'm on my way, pray God, I'm on my way. If you won't go, don't you hinder me. If you won't go, don't you hinder me. Won't go, don't you hinder me. I'm on my way, pray God, I'm on my way. I'm on my way, and I won't turn back. I'm on my way, and I won't turn back. I'm on my way, and I won't turn back. I'm on my way, pray God, I'm on my way. I'm on my way to the freedom land. I'm on my way to the freedom land. I'm on my way to the freedom land. I'm on my way, pray God, I'm on my way.
The pressure on the federal government to ensure basic human rights for American Black people had been building up for decades. The civil rights protests in 1960, 61, and 62 added to that pressure.
The pressure was never greater than in 1963. Early in the year, Dr. King and other Black leaders decided to focus on what they called the most segregated big city in the United States. Birmingham, Alabama. The Black leaders planned a highly visible demonstration of their demands for equality. On April 12, 1963, 2 weeks after the birth of his 4th child, Dr. King, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and 1,000 others marched toward downtown Birmingham. The marchers were in deliberate violation of an order by Police Commissioner Bull Connor expressly forbidding demonstrations. The mass arrests began. As expected, King and Abernathy were arrested and jailed along with many others. King was held for 24 hours in solitary confinement until President Kennedy personally interceded with Birmingham officials. On May 2nd, 1963, a large group of black children joined the Birmingham protests. After a speech by King, they moved toward downtown. Again, the police began making arrests. The same buses that transported the children to segregated schools were now being used to haul them to segregated prisons. Before the day was over, almost 1,000 children were in jail. A day later, another 1,000 children joined the march. This time, the authorities resorted to violence. The marchers were blasted with fire hoses, beaten with clubs, attacked by police dogs, and gassed. At last, on May 10th, 1963, under pressure from the federal government and from outraged world opinion, the leaders of Birmingham accepted the demands of the Freedom Marchers. Having witnessed the abuse of power by Alabama authorities to the humiliating images of American violence and injustice being spread throughout the world, President Kennedy had seen enough.
The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
Kennedy agreed to push landmark civil rights legislation through Congress.
Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
When hundreds of black adults and children filled the jails of Birmingham in 1963, it sent a signal to those in authority. You cannot imprison all of us who demand our rights, so you cannot threaten our movement with jail. We'll just rev up our protests. Paul and Silas bound in jail, got no money for to pay the bail. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. Paul and Silas began to shout. Doors popped open and they walked out. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Well, the only chains we can stand are the chains of hand in hand. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
And by 1963, the head of the Mississippi chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, had already been a civil rights activist for many years. Medgar Evers was in the military during World War II, but when he returned to the Deep South after the war, he bristled at how his fellow blacks were denied basic freedoms that the war had been fought to protect. In 1963, racism struck back at Evers.
Despite the dangers in early 1963, Evers began an active campaign to force the issue of racial inequality in Jackson, Mississippi. He organized demonstrations, went head-to-head with the mayor and the city's business leaders.
We were determined under Medgar's leadership to forge ahead, to crack the system. And they were determined to wipe him out because he was a leader.
On May 28, 1963, the NAACP began sit-ins at Woolworth's, where blacks were not served at the lunch counter. That night, someone threw a Molotov cocktail at Evers' home. Damage was minimal, but the message was clear.
The threats, the danger made life so precious to us. Very seldom did we ever part without saying, I love you, and certainly without embracing each other.
Prophetically, at an NAACP gathering in Jackson on June 7th, Evers told the crowd, I love my children and I love my wife, and I would die and die gladly if that would make a better life for them.
We knew. We held each other tightly a couple of nights before he was killed. And we both cried together. And he said, it's not going to be long. I said to him, I know.
On the night of June 12th, here in what was then the NAACP office, Evers watched with other movement leaders as President John F. Kennedy delivered an impassioned speech on civil rights.
We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. We have a right to expect that the Negro community will be responsible, will uphold the law, but they have a right to expect that the law will be fair, that the Constitution will be colorblind.
Medgar was thrilled with the speech and then met with his NAACP colleagues late into the evening. When their meeting was over, he drove home. In a nearby vacant wooded lot, a sniper crouched behind some honeysuckle. Evers was shot in the back and fell to the ground. Medgar and Murley's worst fears had come true.
I ran to the front door and saw him lying there and screamed. It was only then that the children left that area and came out to join me and asked their father, please get up, Daddy, get up, Daddy.
No longer a father, a husband, an activist, Medgar Evers was now a part of history. Unlike the murders of so many before him, his death was not considered a lynching, but an assassination.
In the state of Mississippi, many years ago, a boy of 14 years got a taste of Southern law. He saw his friend a-hangin', his color was his crime. The blood upon his jacket left a brand upon his mind. Too many martyrs and too many dead. Too many lies, too many empty words were said. Too many times for too many angry men. Oh, let it never be again. His name was Medgar Evers, and he walked his road alone, like Emmett Till and thousands more whose names we'll never know. They tried to burn his home, and they beat him to the ground, but deep inside they both knew what it took to bring him down. Too many martyrs and too many dead. Too many lies, too many empty words were said. Too many times for too many angry men. Oh, let it never be again. many martyrs and too many dead. Too many lies, too many empty words were said. Too many times for too many angry men. Oh, let it never be again. They laid him in his grave while the bugle sounded clear. They laid him in his grave when the victory was near. While we waited for the future, for freedom through the land, the country gained a killer and the country lost a man. Too many martyrs and too many dead. Too many lies, too many empty words were said. Too many times for too many angry men. Oh, let it never be again. Oh, let it never be again.
On the nightly TV news, reports about the Birmingham police battles against civil rights demonstrators and reports about Medgar Evers' assassination horrified many northern white people and energized black people everywhere. And so on August 28th, 1963, thousands and thousands of white and black people marched on Washington, D.C., demanding federal enforcement of laws to end discrimination. Among the marchers were everyday people, farmers, sharecroppers, factory workers, maids, janitors, teachers, plumbers, small business owners, and on and on. The march drew national and international news coverage. The biggest highlight of the rally came when Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. delivered an electrifying speech with the theme, "I Have a Dream."
I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. Let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. Black and white together, black and white together, black and white together, someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
But just 1 month later, after that 1963 March on Washington, white racists struck back. It happened again in Birmingham.
The 16th Street Baptist Church was a symbol of the civil rights movement in Birmingham. The sacred chamber served as a staging point for demonstrations against segregated downtown public facilities. From the steps of the church, hundreds of black marchers, most of them kids, encountered the extreme force of Police Commissioner Bull Connor's attack dogs and high-pressure fire hoses. For radical segregationists like the Klan, the 16th Street Baptist Church became a special target. On a hazy Sunday morning in September of 1963, 4 young black girls attended Sunday school at the 16th Street Church. The day's Bible lesson was, "A Love That Forgives." The 4 girls moved to the basement to don choir robes when suddenly a noise shot through the church like a cannon. A bomb planted near the basement ripped through the house of worship. Under an avalanche of shattered glass, toppled brick, and tangled metal, a gruesome discovery. Cynthia Wesley, age 14. Carol Robertson, age 14. Addie Mae Collins, age 14. And Denise McNair, age 11. All were found dead, their bodies buried atop one another.
Of all the bad things that happened in the South during the Civil Rights era, to me, that was the worst. Because you had 4 innocent little girls that hadn't done anything to anybody going to worship on Sunday morning in church, and they're killed for absolutely no reason except that they were black.
Within days, police were almost certain the bombers were members of the United Klans of America. The key suspect was Dynamite Bob Chambliss, a Klansman suspected in many Birmingham bombings. After a perfunctory investigation, Chambliss and 2 other Klansmen were convicted only of the minor charge of dynamite possession. That finding was overturned on appeal. An FBI investigation resulted in no arrest, no charges.
We are soldiers in the army. We got to fight, although we have to cry. We have to hold up the blood-stained banner. We got to hold it up until we die. My mother was a soldier. She had her hand on the gospel plow. But one day she got old, she couldn't fight anymore. She said, I got to stand here and fight anyhow. We are soldiers in the army. We got to fight, although we have to cry. We got to hold up the blood-stained banner. We got to hold it up until we die. My father was a soldier. He had his hand on the gospel plow. But one day he got old, he couldn't fight anymore. Said, I've got to stand here and fight anyhow. Yo, we are soldiers in the army. We got to fight, although we have to cry. We got to hold up the blood-stained banner. We got to hold it up until we die. The violence against Southern Black people in 1963 prompted civil rights activists to step up their efforts in 1964. They inspired hundreds of their allies in the North, Black and white alike, to come to Mississippi. They called their project Freedom Summer. A major goal was to get Black people registered to vote for the very first time. For decades, Southern Black people were denied and blocked from registering in 2 ways. They were required to answer impossible questions to prove that they were competent, and if they persisted in trying to register, they were threatened with violence. And so hundreds of Freedom Summer volunteers flooded Mississippi in 1964. Many were white college students in their early 20s. Others were Southern Blacks who had suffered through racism their whole lives. Southern racists saw it as a Northern invasion of outside-in agitators. A violent backlash was inevitable.
The students were warned of violence and of the possibility of death once they crossed the Mississippi state line.
People in this room understand, one, that people should expect to get beatings, and that
The first wave of recruits, including 20-year-old Andrew Goodman from New York City, left Saturday, June 20th for Mississippi. Goodman rode with veteran civil rights workers James Chaney, age 21, and Michael Schwerner, age 24. Sunday, June 21st, on Andy Goodman's first day in Mississippi, the 3 men drove to investigate the burning of a Black Methodist church. The church had been the scene of a civil rights meeting just weeks before. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, their 1963 blue Ford station wagon was stopped by Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price outside the town of Philadelphia. The 3 young men were released by Deputy Price around 10:30 that night. It was then that they disappeared. In Oxford, Ohio, volunteers were waiting to travel south.
We had to tell the students what we thought was going on, because if, in fact, anyone is arrested and then taken out of the jail, then the chances that they're alive was just almost zero. And we had to confront the students with that before they went down, because they now had, the ball game was changed.
Within days, the disappearance was national news. A massive search was ordered by President Lyndon Johnson. 200 sailors from the Naval Air Station in Meridian moved into the Philadelphia area and were joined there by FBI agents.
In Meridian, the wife of missing Mickey Schwerner, Rita Schwerner, flew from Oxford, where she'd been training many of the summer volunteers. She was greeted by James Farmer, head of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality.
It's tragic, as far as I'm concerned, that white Northerners have to be caught up in the machinery of injustice and indifference in the South before the American people register concern. I personally suspect that if Mr. Cheney, who is a native Mississippian Negro, had been alone at the time of the disappearance, that this case, like so many others that have come before, would have gone completely unnoticed.
While the search for the missing civil rights workers continued, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The new law increased the federal government's power to ban discrimination in public places, but did little to give Southern blacks the vote. On August 4th, on a farm outside the town of Philadelphia, the bodies of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were discovered buried together in an earthen dam. The autopsy reports indicated that the men had been killed by .38 caliber bullets. A later report revealed that James Cheney, the one black victim, had also suffered severe bone and skull fractures.
Freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. No more killing, no, no more killing. No more killing over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. They'll be singing, they'll be singing, they'll I'll be a slave. I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
The 1964 murders sparked support for the civil rights movement from people all across the nation. But the murders prompted some in the movement to begin to rethink their nonviolent philosophy. Still, most of the activists kept their tactic of not fighting back. But that did not, though, spark a nonviolent response from white Southern law enforcers. In 1965, when some Alabama activists marched to protest the arrest of a fellow activist, they were attacked by state troopers. 26-year-old Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was black, tried to escape the violence by running into a cafe with his mother and his grandfather. But troopers followed them and beat them. When Jackson tried to protect his mother, one trooper shot him, and Jackson later died. To protest that death and the continuing resistance of Alabama officials to end racial discrimination and grant full voting power to blacks, civil rights leaders announced they would march all the way from Selma to the state capital, Montgomery. But violence struck again, twice. A Unitarian minister who'd come to Selma from Boston, James Reeb, was beaten and killed by white segregationists. And as the protest marchers tried to begin their long walk, Alabama authorities nipped that effort in the bud with more violence.
600 people gathered at Brown Chapel AME Church on Sunday, March 7th, to begin the march to Montgomery. Dr. King was preaching in Atlanta. Hosea Williams and John Lewis led the march. Lewis chose to march even though his organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, opposed SCLC's strategy and decided not to take part. Surprisingly, as they walked through the center of town, there were no police in sight. The route out of Selma crossed over the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
It'll be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You have to disperse. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue.
President Johnson, sensing the mood of the country, addressed Congress on national television.
What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is
8 days after Bloody Sunday, 4 days after Reeb's death, the president asked for a comprehensive voting rights bill and astonished the nation by using the words of the movement.
Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Civil rights activists quickly tried to organize a second march from Selma to Montgomery, and it began to attract hundreds of sympathizers from the North. But a court issued an injunction against the protest. That's why demonstrators, now led by Martin Luther King Jr., turned back after barely marching at all. The old saying was, the third time is a charm. And it turned out to be true. Civil rights advocates put out a call to their allies from across the country.
And that is when thousands, black and white together, descended on Selma for what turned out to be a successful march all the way to the Capitol. This time, federal marshals took control of security, so instead of facing violence from local police, sheriffs, and state troopers, the marchers were shielded from violence.
Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on the kingdom land. Ain't gonna let no jailhouse turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let no jailhouse turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on the freedom land. Ain't gonna let segregation turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let segregation turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on the freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on the freedom land. So the first half of the 1960s decade was often dominated by famous people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But the movement for social justice was about much more. The movement would never have happened without so-called ordinary people, people whose names that most of us are not familiar with. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the name of human rights. Thousands and thousands of everyday citizens whose names were not household words protested for civil rights and risked losing their jobs, their freedom, and their lives. Some were white, but most were black people. Some did lose their lives in the process, and here are just a few of the usually unknown martyrs of the civil rights movement.
September 25th, 1961, Liberty, Mississippi. Herbert Lee, who had worked to help register black voters, was killed by a state legislator who claimed self-defense and was never arrested. Lewis Allen, a black man who witnessed the murder, was later also killed. April 9th, 1962, Taylorsville, Mississippi. Corporal Roman Ducksworth, Jr., a military police officer stationed in Maryland, was on leave to visit his sick wife when he was ordered off a bus by a police officer and shot dead. The police officer may have mistaken Ducksworth for a freedom rider who was testing bus desegregation laws.
April 23rd, 1963, Attala, Alabama. William Lewis Moore, a postman from Baltimore, was shot and killed during a one-man march against segregation. Moore had planned to deliver a letter to the governor of Mississippi urging an end to intolerance. September 15th, 1963, Birmingham, Alabama. Virgil Lamar Ware, who was only 13 years old, was riding on the handlebars of his brother's bicycle when he was fatally shot by white teenagers. The white youths had come from a segregationist rally held in the aftermath of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. On March 23, 1964, in Jacksonville, Florida, Johnny Mae Chappell was murdered as she walked along a roadside. Her killers were white men looking for a black person to shoot following a day of racial unrest.
July 11th, 1964, Colbert, Georgia, Lieutenant Colonel Lemuel Penn, a Washington, D.C. educator, was driving home from U.S. Army Reserves training when he was shot and killed by Klansmen in a passing car. March 25th, 1965, the Selma Highway in Alabama, Viola Gregg Liuzzo, a housewife and mother from Detroit, drove alone to Alabama to help with the Selma March after seeing televised reports of the attack at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. She was driving marchers back to Selma from Montgomery when she was shot and killed by a Klansman in a passing car. And August 20th, 1965, Haynesville, Alabama, Jonathan Myrick Daniels, an Episcopal Seminary student in Boston, had come to Alabama to help with black voter registration. He was arrested at a demonstration, jailed in Haynesville, and then suddenly released. Moments after his release, though, he was shot to death by a deputy sheriff. Those just some of the relatively unknown martyrs of the civil rights movement.
The 1965 Selma to Montgomery March symbolized a high point of black and white people struggling together for the civil rights cause. After that, though, a new thrust took over the movement. Fed up with constantly being violently attacked, some black civil rights activists actually adopted a new theme. They called it Black Power. They told white activists, we're kicking you out of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. If you want to help us, stop coming to the black community. Go back to your own white community and push for an end to racism there. We black activists will do the work in the black community, and we're no longer so much interested in integration as we are in building up black businesses, black economic stability, and black voting power. Malcolm X was one inspiring black leader who had been preaching that thrust for several years until he also was assassinated. And as the 60s progressed, race riots erupted across the USA. First came Watts, then during the long hot summer of 1967 came Detroit and dozens of other cities. And later in 1968, after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, more than 100 cities and towns exploded in gunshots, looting, and fires. Black Power activists preached an alternative to nonviolence. If you're attacked, they said, fight back. Black nationalism and Black Panthers became the headlines of the day.
Still, the new history that was written could not obliterate the history that had been written earlier in the 1960s. Once upon a time, blacks and whites held hands together, sang together, marched together, were beaten together, were jailed together, and sometimes were murdered together.
We want to thank everyone who has tuned in to recall that unique era. We want to thank all the photographers and reporters who captured the compelling film of that era. And we want to thank all those who've put it onto the internet for us to look back on. PBS, the History Channel, and many others. And also a special thanks to Bill's wife, Randy. She's been running all of our video and sound equipment and this recording equipment today. And she's also helped to search out these fascinating documentary segments that bring these moments, these momentous historical events back to life.
In 1965, a song was born that looked ahead, and it is today's final song and the conclusion to our program. The song's theme is that history is on the side of freedom. In the 1800s, a Unitarian minister, Theodore Parker, had once declared, "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And in the 1960s, Martin Luther King also used that quote. The thrust: that as long as human beings struggle for freedom and justice, in the long scheme of history, the march toward freedom is inevitable. It's the same thrust as this 1965 song.
People get ready, there's a train coming. You don't need no baggage, you just get on board. All you need is faith to hear the diesels humming. You don't need no ticket, you just thank the Lord. So now, people get ready, there's a train to Jordan. It's picking up passengers coast to coast. Faith is the key to open doors and board them. There is hope for all among those loved the most. So people get ready, there's a train coming. You don't need no baggage, you just get on board. All you need is faith to hear the diesels humming. You don't need no ticket, you just thank the Lord. There ain't no room for the hopeless sinner who has hurt all mankind just to save his own. Have pity on those whose chances grow thinner, for there's no hiding place against the kingdom's throne. People get ready, there's a train coming. You don't need no baggage, you just get on board. All you need is faith to hear the diesels humming. You don't need no ticket, you just thank the Lord.
You should turn this up. There we go. Put it there. Okay.
All right, here we are. So thanks again so much to Bill and Randy for this excellent production. I can't say enough about Randy and your amazing production skills. So just thank you for being the everything that makes this work behind the scenes. And Bill, as always, it's always a joy to sing with you. It looks like we're going to be taking some questions over here. And I just want to just really point out, I said this during the presentation, but the various forms of art that we interacted with there, that really help pull together this story of a movement that we will never forget. And that is music, that's journalism, that's photography, that's filmmaking, that's storytelling. So many forms of art go into telling the story about a social justice situation. I just wanted to do that real quick as we look to the chat to see if we have any questions. Here comes one. Okay, so you can send a message to Chris, and she can unmute your mic if you want to ask um, using your mic, or you can type it in. You would add that question to the Q&A section. While we're looking for questions, Bill, Randy, do you have anything you would like to say?
Well, I would just say, thank God that despite all the threats by the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazis and everybody else down in the Deep South, thank God that at least there were some journalists, TV stations, documentary film people, photographers, newspaper photographers and newspaper reporters. Thank God that they were there to at least document some of the violence against the civil rights movement. It's a miracle that so much evidence still exists photographically. I'm amazed at it, because the very first, there would be think about it, if this happened, well, we don't need to think about it. We know what happens today. Everybody has their cell phone out. There's 10 different angles on everything. But back then, of course, the Ku Klux Klan and the racist sheriffs, the first people they clobbered sometimes were the photographers, and confiscated their film, exposed it to the light. So there was very little evidence of some of this violence against the civil rights movement. But thank God, enough of it lives on and survives. And then you combine that with 10, 20, 30 years later, as you saw in a lot of those documentary segments, the civil rights activists would think back and tell stories about what happened. So, you combine the interviews that were done in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, looking back at the 1960s events, and you put those together. It's a very compelling story.
Yeah. Yeah, during the program, we had various people, Valerie, Jack Sullivan, a few others that were just recalling some of their own experiences from the South. And Jack mentioned how his dad barely escaped. And Valerie says it doesn't feel 50 or 60 years ago. It feels so very contemporary. And I wonder if that's because, I wonder how far the needle has moved since then. I think for me, like, I went through this period. I didn't live through the Civil Rights movement of the 60s. So I was born in the 70s, and I think I lived in a post-racial society with probably a bunch of other people. Or a post-racial illusion.
You thought you did,
right? Yeah, because we didn't have social media, and so we weren't. These stories weren't as accessible. I'm gonna paste in the chat, Bill, when you mentioned photography. I have a friend, PJ. He's also an amazing bartender. So talk about art and social justice. He's a photographer, and his website, jossford.com, is his photography website. And I sent you a link to that because under the street section, there are some very compelling, very deeply moving photos from the protest from last summer that PJ went down and captured with his camera. And they're in color, but if they were in black and white, you could easily superimpose them into 50 or 60 years ago. I saw some questions here. Yes, Chris, bartending is an art, and it can help you through a social justice experience.
Can you read it?
Here's a question for Bill. Bill, what are some of the ways you notice journalism has changed since the 1960s civil rights movement to the present civil rights movement?
Well, I'd say there's a heck of a lot more people journalism. In other words, non-professional journalists who are documenting all these events with their cell phones and they're going live. You know, you can even go live. I mean, Paisha, you yourself, you're a good example. Paisha, you're not a professional journalist, but you're an activist. And there you were downtown Columbus months ago. I tuned in and watched for an hour or two of you live streaming demonstrations in downtown Columbus and the police reaction and so forth. So there's so much more documentation of everything that goes on, including these events with police, which we never had before. What you saw today were all, you know, mass demonstrations for the most part, where journalists would come, and so they would be at that, but they couldn't be at individual events where police were confronting people. So I think there's just a lot more. There's a lot more journalism, and then of course there's a lot more advocacy, I'd say too. And sometimes the line is blurry between journalism and advocacy, but at least it gets the information out there.
Yeah.
A lot more, gets it out there to everybody.
Yeah, everybody with a cell phone
Right.
can receive it.
Right.
Or a home computer.
I think that might be helpful. I know it seems like justice is slow, but I think that regular person activism and journalism is becoming a tool to help bring justice, I guess, more, hopefully, a little more often. Kathy wanted to know how long we've been singing together.
I don't know, what do you, probably, I would think 10 years at
I
least.
think it's almost 10 years.
Yeah.
My first time was Bill. Some of you might have gone to this, but Bill, for 36 years that you did the Spirit of the 60s, 1960s coffee house. And so Bill has been doing that far before I came on the scene. And then one day he had this brilliant idea that I was going to stand up out of his very quiet audience and just burst out singing "Oh Freedom." So that started our journey, and then out of that came this program here. So yeah, close to 10 years.
Yeah, it's wonderful singing with you.
I love singing with you too. Our harmonies are really make me feel good.
You know, you get energy from each other. And then, of course, when you have an in-person audience, then you really get energy from the audience. So
yeah, that's really exciting.
But that's also the art of allowing people to take in that same information differently, is when you sing, it presents it in a very different way. And so it's not officially learning, you're participating.
Yeah, so you're like, it's easy learning, right? Because you're learning as you go. And you know, honestly, like I said this in the chat too, but I learned so much from this program as I learned the program to perform it. We got some comments. We love listening to you. That's from Molly. Thank you, Molly. Here's one from Chris. Chris says, if we could talk about music during the moments of active protest, etc., and then the role of music in programs that reach different audiences at times, like this one. Have we seen it change in people or other effects that it has in the wider movement?
Paisha, you should answer this, because you have for the last year, and I know even beyond that, in the past, but you are there at a lot of demonstrations, and sometimes in between the speeches, there you are singing a song. So you know what it's like to help energize a crowd.
Yeah, so I think what I want to say, because during the moments of active protest, what I have seen, and like I said, I'm only like 4 or 5 years into the protest side of activism. And so I'm still learning from activists, but what you can see is that people start writing songs in active protest. So you'll see these new songs arise out of the crowd. And I learned that from a visit to the Poor People's Campaign retreat, where it's sort of like kind of expected that a new song will rise out of this moment. I know we're still singing some of the older songs, but there's this song that I heard in this time around about a most recent person, whoever it is that we're protesting about at the time, which is really sad. We would say their name and call them a freedom rider. And the song says, "What side are you on, my people? What side are you on?" And I learned that in an act of protest. So just those songs that come and arise like creatively out of the movement or the moment, they're still very, very much infused with this power or this regenerative, like moving force that helps you to just stay engaged and stay, in the fight and feel emboldened and, inspired and encouraged to go on.
I would add just one thing to this, the question here about how it can be used to change people and so forth, just up there a little bit more. Yeah, have you seen it change people and so forth? I don't know about the music so much, but I mean, that footage of the documentary footage of what the early civil rights people went through, just for simple things like we like to be able to vote and drink from the same drinking fountain, okay? I mean, just so low level, basic right. I think that just showing that kind of footage, with or without music, would be helpful to prod people to vote. I don't think, I know obviously the activists know the history of the civil rights movement, but I have a feeling that younger people, black and white together again, don't know what people went through just to get the right to vote without being threatened by the Ku Klux Klan when they go to the courthouse. And I think showing that before an election could be very helpful, showing snippets of what people went through and the violence against the civil rights movement. I think that might educate, more people. Okay, yes, we should get out and vote. Look what our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, and unnamed people, look what all those people went through just to win me the right to vote today. I should take it seriously.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's music itself, but also to your point, Bill, as far as changing people and journalism and people journalism, that video that seemed to go viral last summer that Bill mentioned that I did, I've had people come to me that that said that they were changed by what they saw, that they didn't realize that this was how bad it was. And that's the exact reason why I went to that protest with the intention to go live, is because it became very exhausting trying to convince those who are still in that post-racial illusion that this is happening. So whether it's music or music coupled with video, like where in this program, Randy, you played us singing as the video was happening, and I hadn't watched that for myself, and it gave me chills because I just felt the energy of the people marching, and not being moved. So yeah, I think I can't say that I've always seen music change people per se, but I just think the combination of all the arts gives us a visual and a sonic way to think differently and then take new information. I want to read Jack's comment because I agree. In addition to the movement music, Jack Sullivan, Reverend Jack Sullivan Jr., who is the director of the Ohio Council of Churches, he says that in addition to the movement music performed today, I've been nurtured by songs from Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, on up to Jill Scott, and me too. Stevie's great. Stevie Wonder is excellent at getting you to dance and enjoy a protest song. I wish I could do that. He's so good. But Jack says that there's some of the contemporary musicians contributing to the justice movement. And that's so true. Valerie says, and the songs arise to steal people's courage.
Right.
Marvin Gaye. Yeah. Jill Scott sings of wanting clean water. I remember that song. Yeah. Let's see what else we got here. Okay, Danny Russell has a question to Bill. He says, "Good to see you again after your time working together on the 1990s. He's curious to hear me and you mention some of our favorite current day music around social justice."
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. See, I'm an old guy, okay? I'm kind of, I know all the stuff from the 60s, whether it was Phil Oakes or Bob Dylan or Peter, Paul and Mary or Harry Belafonte, all the social justice singers and songs from that era. But you know, the older you get, well, this doesn't apply to everybody, it applies to me. I mean, I'm not much up with pop culture. So I don't know many of the
Valerie put Hell You Talking About by Janelle Monáe. That one's good. Kendrick Lamar has so much justice music. Childish Gambino has a song called This Is America. And the video is just breathtaking. There's a song, it's not that current, it's probably 6 years old, but Glory by John Legend and Common. I don't know if I call Stevie Wonder current pop, but he's a staple. And he's got the song called You Haven't Done Nothing, which is even today, it's an old song, but even today is still very relevant. It looks like Valerie put some songs in the chat there. So yeah, those are some of the ones. Tracy Chapman, like I said, this is not new either, but talking about her evolution, she's a great storyteller. Tim Wood has a question. Do either of us do protest work in other media besides video and music?
In other media.
Other media, no.
Mm-mm.
No.
I make ceramics and I focus on the fat black woman Venus archetype. And it's an indirect protest. It's to protest body shaming and to elevate body positivity. Fat phobia is rooted in anti-blackness, so I boldly portray the fat black body figure just to keep it elevated and lifted up as desirable and worthy of love just like anybody else.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bethany, for the link to This Is America. Yes, and Kathy says continue to add those songs in there so that people can check them out. Does anybody else have anything to say before we let Bill and Randy go? Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on a Friday. Thank you, Bill and Randy, for your work. I
hope the rest of this is great. It's really a lovely event.
It's a great idea to talk about art and music and the movement and social justice because, yes, it fit together 60 years ago, fits together today.
It really does. And your program really just does a great job combining all those forms of art to help people understand the times. Barbara Fant is going to be with us after the break. She will be here joining us at 2:30, so I hope to see you guys back. Barbara is going to be talking about Black joy in the time of turbulence, and her art form is poetry. Barbara is a fiery, electrifying poet, so I hope you guys come back at 2:30 to join us. And thanks again to Bill and Randy. We're going to take a break, and 2:30 we'll be hearing from Barb.